Change is hard. I have yet to meet anyone who absolutely loves change. We don't like it when our family or our friends move away. We don't like it when our favorite restaurant or store closes. We don't like it when something changes at work. We don't even like it when something changes at church. It's true, you don't. But why? Because change is hard. Even when it's good, it's hard. Saul, aka Paul, experiences the change of all changes some 3 years after Jesus had died and the disciples had experienced him risen. The story we just heard tells us that the risen Christ reaches out and changes Saul, the once Jewish persecutor, now known as Paul, perhaps the greatest sharer of Jesus' teaching in those earliest days. The risen Christ reached out and brought complete transformation, a transformation that I can only imagine Paul would not have guessed to be coming in a million years. And the risen Christ reached out to Ananias and brought him to do something that seemed absolutely ridiculous. Presenting himself to the one who was known in the entire region for being probably the cruelest persecutor of Jews, of Jesus' followers, and he goes to them and goes to Saul and says, "Hi, it's me." The risen Christ gave Ananias the strength to do what seemed unimaginable and kind of foolish. 3 years after Jesus had died, long after the initial tomb was empty, long after the women had gone to embalm the body in the tomb and they found it empty, long after Peter didn't believe the women and he went to the tomb, also finding it empty, long after the risen Christ in some form or other had appeared on the road with Cleopas and the other disciple, walking along on the road to Emmaus, long after that risen Christ had broken bread at the table with the disciples, making them know him again, the risen Christ continues to change lives. Long after the initial resurrection period is over, long after the Bible tells us that Jesus had ascended into heaven, long after that. So we might not know exactly what happened on Easter, whether it was bodily resurrection or figurative resurrection or Jesus the zombie or, who knows what was going on. Long after that, the risen Christ is changing lives. Author Anne Lamott talks about the risen Christ like this. She writes, "I became aware of someone with me, hunkered down in the corner, and I just assumed it was my father, whose presence I had felt over the years when I was frightened or alone. The feeling was so strong," she said, "I actually turned the light on and to make sure that no one was there, and of course, there wasn't. But after a while in the dark again, I knew beyond any doubt that it was Jesus. I felt him as surely as I feel my dog lying next to me as I write this. and I was appalled, she wrote. I thought about my life and my brilliant, hilarious, progressive friends, and I thought that about what everyone would think of me if I became a Christian. And it seemed utterly impossible that something this simple would be allowed to happen to me. I turned to the wall that night and said out loud, I would rather die. But I felt him sitting there in the corner of my sleeping loft, watching me with patience and love. And I squinched my eyes shut, but that didn't help because that was not what I was using to see him. Finally, I fell asleep, and in the morning, he was gone. She continues, and this is where it gets great. The experience spooked me so badly that I thought it was an apparition. But then everywhere I went, I had this feeling that a little cat was following me, wanting me to reach down and pick it up, wanting me to open the door and let it in. But I knew what would happen. You let that cat in one time, give it a little milk, and then it stays forever. So I tried to keep one step ahead of it, she said, slamming my house door anytime I entered or left. And a week later, she said, when I went back to church, this time I stayed for the sermon, which I thought was so ridiculous, like someone trying to convince me of the existence of extraterrestrials. But the last song was so deep and raw and pure that I could not escape. And she continued, it was as if the people were singing in between the notes, weeping and joyful at the same time. And I felt like their voices or something was rocking me in its bosom, holding me like a scared kid. And I opened up to that feeling, and it washed over me. And she ended her story by saying, I began to cry. And I left before the benediction, and I raced home, and I felt that cat running along my heels. And I walked down the dock past a dozen of potted flowers, and under the sky as blue as one of God's own dreams. And I opened the door to my house, and I stood there for a minute. And I hung my head and said, okay, I quit. And she said, I took a deep breath and said, all right, you can come in. The risen Christ follows us, nips at our heels, knocks at our door, reaches out and brings us in. The risen Christ did that for Anne Lamott in the story she tells so beautifully. The risen Christ does that for us. Reaches out, draws us in ways we can't quite explain. Draws us closer to one another, to God. The risen Christ brings changes in our lives that we want to laugh at, to run from, to hide from, and yet we can't. The risen Christ brings us to this table this table of welcome, this table of care, this table of nurture, this table that fills us with strength for the journey. Because we know that that journey always involves change, even when we don't like it. This table welcomes you and me. Come, let us gather in the presence of the risen Christ at this table.